Jeff and I have had the good fortune of being part of the advisory committee, but we've also had the good fortune of, in recent years, looking for opportunities to really work together. And so I think it's exciting for both of us to see the conversation that we've had in this room today, and we look forward to really hoping to see that this conversation really keep on. I think the takeaways and what I would hope you would go away from here today would be to think about what could you do as an individual to keep this conversation, this dialogue, to further the things we've talked about today in your own community as an individual? How could your community approach the issues we've discussed today? And how could our state really approach the issues that we've talked about today? And so just from an individual standpoint, just some thoughts that I have, and Jeff will share some of his own thoughts. I would hope that as individuals that we would ourselves commit to being willing to really bust assumptions. Tom and this last panel did a really good job of talking about what some of those assumptions are. And often assumptions aren't right. And be willing to put yourself in the shoes of a perspective that you don't understand, that isn't you, that isn't your community, and be open to maybe it's not what you've read it is, or maybe it's not what you think it is. Be willing to bust assumptions. Be willing to reach out to a group. All of us, serve in, whether it's our church or it's a civic group or who it might be. Be willing as a group that may be curious about a topic or another place or what it's like to live in rural North Carolina. Be willing to reach out and really bring someone into your group to have that conversation. My good friend Phil Kirk, who I saw earlier, I don't know if he's still in the room, but he just invited me to come speak to the Raleigh Kiwanis Club and tell them everything they need to know about rural North Carolina, which I really look forward to doing. Jeff and I also had the opportunity to speak to the Charlotte City Council recently in their board retreat. Along with Natalie English, yeah. Right. Be willing, one thing we can all do as individuals, think about how you're going to spend your next long weekend. Spend it in a place where you don't live every day. Go to a small town, explore, spend money, try a restaurant, see what that community has to offer. Or if you live in a small town, go to the big city and do the exact same thing. And then also all of us, really important statistic, nearly half of the adults living in the state of North Carolina were not born in the state of North Carolina. Commit yourself to really learning about the history and the culture of this state. Whether you were born here or whether you weren't, let's all commit to learning more about the history and culture of this place we call home.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. We were asked to give our observations as part of this wrap-up, and probably my biggest takeaway from today is that Dana Weston is a much better singer than Leslie Boney. And on an individual level, what I can assure you that I won't do is try to sing here this afternoon because they are both better than me. So on an individual level, one of the things, and it's a follow-up and a corollary to what Patrick said about busting assumptions, and that is to challenge ourselves, to take ourselves out of our comfort zones. Now, that's something that's really easy for someone like me. I work at something called the UNC Charlotte Urban Institute, but I was born and raised in a small rural community in Stanley County between Albemarle and Baden. And yet I live in that transitional space in the town of Davidson that is more suburban. So moving between cultures and communities is something that I'm very comfortable with, but I think we all have to challenge ourselves increasingly to put ourselves out of those comfort zones, particularly I think in this day and age when we are experiencing so much tribalism, and much of that tribalism takes place in part because of geography, not just physical geography, but also I think the virtual geography of social media. So that would be, on an individual level, one of the things that I would challenge us all to do more of.
At a community level, one of the things we could do as communities is reach out to another community, do a community-to-a-community exchange between rural and urban. Really, if there's leadership development programs at local and regional levels all across this state. Let's cross-pollinate between those leadership development programs by really sharing some time together. A couple of ideas of how we could connect on community levels.
I think one of the biggest things that we can do at a community level is to embrace diversity in all its forms. Now, I was really struck by the conversation earlier today about the beloved community and the work that they are doing. But as we have this conversation about urban-rural, our minds immediately go to presenting and creating opportunities for us to talk with those outside of our place of where we live, the urban areas or the rural areas. But I think a great starting place is to actually look around in the communities we live in today. I think it was our friend from UPS who talked about the block parties that she organizes in her neighborhood in Davidson. You know, among the myths that we have, and we all know that for rural communities to really be successful, they need to embrace newcomers. And for those of us in the urban area, we understand that to succeed, we need to better understand the issues of rural North Carolina if we ever hope that our policymakers, our elected officials, can help us address the big issues that can help sustain that economic success that we have enjoyed, like infrastructure and education. But instead of immediately, in an artificial way, going out and beginning to talk to our rural neighbors, you know, if you live in a small town, there already are many newcomers, but they don't always have a seat at the table. And I think it's important that we invite them to the table to begin those discussions. And in urban areas, you know, despite the myth, the perception, those urban elites are not all transplants from other metropolitan regions. Many are people just like me who are living and working in these urban communities. And if we just reach out and begin to talk with these folks in our own community, I think it'll begin the dialogue and it'll make it easier for us to have those harder conversations when we go outside of our local neighborhood.
What can we do at a state level? A couple of ideas. We've heard so much today about the importance of regional collaboration. And that's certainly one of the major tenets that we're working around at the Rural Center. But we do not do enough at the state level. In fact, we have divested ourselves of a lot of interest in regional organizations. We really need to increase that investment in building the capacity of regional organizations to be more effective. Secondly, balanced statewide economic development policy. Economic development is not a one-size-fits-all game for everyone. And too often the economic development discussion is driven by one strategy, and it's the recruitment strategy. And we've heard a lot about that here today, and it's almost the default that economic development equals recruitment. Yes, it does, but actually economic development equals recruitment and retention, and helping the businesses that are already there, and helping the new entrepreneurs start and grow and be as successful as they can possibly be. A more balanced statewide economic development policy that invests in all three of those strategies would really help move rural and urban communities forward together. And then I think something that we heard from one of the speakers earlier today, actually Carl Stauber, and every time I hear Carl Stauber, I feel like I've been to the mountaintop. You know, I love this man. And he said start with some of the fundamentals. We've got some really big issues in this state, and they're front burner issues. We developed something at the Rural Center called the 10 Strategies for the Future of Rural North Carolina. And arguably, you could take all 10 of our rural strategies, and urban communities might agree, well, those are the top 10 urban strategies. But the reason they're on the rural list and the solutions and the way we go about implementing those strategies look very different than they would in an urban community. So we might agree on that the big issues on the table are education, transportation, and broadband, to name three. But the rural and the urban dimensions of those issues look very different.
So when I think about the state level, I think about this forum series that the Institute for Emerging Issues has been sponsoring with the name ReCONNECT in it. At the Urban Institute, we are working on a project right now funded by the Duke Endowment to try to build greater connections between urban and rural North Carolina, in particular between Charlotte and her surrounding neighbors. And when we talk about that project, we talk about how historically, and we heard several people mention this today, historically it was connected. And it was often connected through those legacy industries of textiles and furniture and tobacco. But in many ways, not entirely, but in many ways, those legacy industries are now gone. But there are still, in my opinion, thinking about the statewide level, there are still many legacy institutions in this state that were built throughout the 20th century. And they were built around this notion that this was both an urban and rural state. And so there's this incredible reach we have here in North Carolina between our university system and community college system, cooperative extension service, the rural center. I could go on down the list, and with this crowd, I'm certainly going to leave someone out. And so my challenge to all of us is, yes, embrace innovation and creativity and new ideas, and we heard a lot of them today, but let's also reinvigorate those legacy institutions that were built during a time of greater urban-rural cooperation and collaboration, and let's figure out how we can use them again in the 21st century to reconnect and rebuild these relationships. So,